Hello, I'd like to talk about the concept of consent of the governed. And I'm talking about this because it's been in my mind quite a bit since yesterday. Because yesterday I was sitting my history exam, one of the sessions of my history exam, the second of 3 sessions. My third session is tomorrow. And it was the European history paper. It's European and International History. And I was writing one of the essays of the exam. And in the essay I briefly compared the Congress of Vienna and the agreements that were reached within that settlement, and I compared it to the Treaty of Versailles. Just over 100 years later, the Congress of Vienna was in 1815 and the Treaty of Versailles was in 1919. And the point of comparison that I reached, or there were multiple points of comparison because they are quite comparable, but the one that I'd like to touch on today is the idea that they didn't consult, they didn't seek the consent of those who would be affected, of the quote-unquote ordinary people who would be affected by their decisions. Neither treaty did that. Now, you could say that Woodrow Wilson's point, one of his points, was self-determination, but in the actual treaty itself there wasn't actually much self-determination. The German people did not self-determine that they would have to pay such a harsh indemnity, and so on and so forth. And of course, because neither treaty or treaty system tried to seek that consent of the governed, the consent of the people who will be affected by it, the people on the ground who will be affected by it, they both had similar consequences in that the people affected worst by the treaty turned to radicalism. For the Congress of Vienna, you can see in the revolutions or revolts of 1830, and more so in 1848, you can see that because ordinary Europeans didn't feel as though they were fairly represented and fairly governed according to their own wishes, according to their own ideals, they turned to radicalism, they turned to nationalism and liberalism in their 19th century forms. And it did lead to bloodshed. It led to bloodshed in 1830 and it led to bloodshed in 1848 on a much bigger scale. And of course, those caused instability. In France in 1830, you get instability in that it goes into the throne goes from the restored Bourbon throne to an Orleanist liberal throne. Louis Philippe was definitely a liberal king. He was the citizen king with a different title, and yes, that was a point of instability. France was under different leadership, very, very, very different leadership, but it was imposed on France by the people of Paris. And in 1848 you get a complete toppling of the whole system of government in France, because you go from monarchy, a royal monarchy, as opposed to a French imperial monarchy under the Bonapartes. You go from a royal monarchy to a republic. So it's instability. And really, yes, it is all caused by the Congress of Vienna, which affected the French people very badly, because France was, the villain, so to speak, in Europe since their revolution. And then that was made even worse with Napoleon and his ambitions over Europe. And then if we see the treaty's successor in some sense, in terms of importance, in terms of circumstances, that would be the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. We can see that the German people were affected the worst in that treaty, in that they lost territory. They were forced to pay a very heavy indemnity. There were military, there were restraints on their military capacity. And then in the 1930s you get a very upset German populace, which felt like it had been unfairly treated. You know, I mean, the German people didn't necessarily decide to go into World War One. They certainly fought in World War One, but this was not really ordinary people's faults. And then they didn't even give consent to what happened. There was no sense of working with the German people. And I'm not saying this is wrong necessarily, but that is how they saw it. And they turned to a very vicious form of radical political ideology, perhaps one could call it populism, and that is National Socialism, Nazism, under Adolf Hitler. And of course, this led to bloodshed. It led to World War II, because Adolf Hitler was obviously very ambitious and, you know, had his eyes on most of Europe, if not all, eventually. And yes, and that can be connected directly to the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that the people who came up with the Treaty of Versailles did not seek the consent of the German people. You can argue over whether that consent was warranted, but that is what happened. They did not seek the consent of the German people in the very clauses of the Treaty of Versailles. It was simply imposed on Germany, which does seem right, especially for that time, but it did have negative consequences. And we also see it now in the contemporary day. President Trump of the United States, Donald Trump, didn't campaign on any sort of promise to engage in a regime change war in Iran. And now he's doing it without the consent of the American people. And you can say, all right, well, they didn't vote for it, but what do the polls show? Well, the polls show that the vast majority, by an extreme margin, of American people don't support the war. And indeed, they elected a president who seemed to be anti-war. But he's doing it anyway, and we can argue over whether that war is right or wrong. But he's doing it anyway, and he's doing it without the consent of the American people. He didn't campaign for it, and the polls show that the American people are, by and large, against it. And it does look like like the American people are going to turn to radicalism in a sense, because they look like they're going to do the most offensive thing that the American people can do to their president, the most offensive legal thing that they can do to their president, which is to vote against his party in the midterms. And it does look like the Democrats are going to win the House and maybe the Senate. And that is going to cause a very, very itchy second half of Donald Trump's presidential term, his final presidential term. And that will be troublesome for him. It's a radical solution that the people are certainly going to do, it looks like, because they don't feel like they've given consent to this. They don't even feel like Trump has asked for their consent, and so they are going to punish him in the voting booth, just like Europeans in the 19th century did in the 1830 and 1848 revolts, and just like the German people did when they empowered a vicious Nazi regime. And so this should teach us a lesson. It should teach us the lesson that you need the consent of the governed. You need that consent, or you will be toppled, because the people are not just going to let it happen. They will refuse their consent if they're asked for it, and if they're not asked for it, they'll seek other ways to punish the government which has not asked for their consent. So this should teach all leaders a lesson. It should teach us all that consent of the governed is not only just an ideal, but it is a real force in politics, in the art of government, so to speak. And so I'd just like us all to think about consent of the governed, to think about the importance of consent of the governed, and how this affects us. What should we do when governments do something that is completely antithetical to what seems to be the thoughts of the people? And we see that in Britain, where, Labour promised not to raise taxes in the 2024 general election. They won that election on a manifesto of not raising taxes. What did they do? They raised taxes. And that's a particularly disgusting example, because the people gave their consent to a Labour government which would not raise taxes. But what did they get? They got a Labour government which did raise taxes against the wishes of the electorate, something that they did not have a mandate to do, and that's deeply wrong, and they got punished for it in the 2025 local elections, and they're about to be punished for it in the 2026 local elections, and they probably will be punished for it in the next general election, whenever that may be. So yes, consent of the governed, it's not just an ideal, it's a reality. Thank you.